What are the concerns standing in the way of China making the 5% target this year? Very little. The real question, can it be sustained?
What it really shows is a deeper understanding of some of the challenge that actually related to pushing consumption up from the Chinese government.
In the very long term, my bet would be on the AI plus or kind of technology-driven consumption, because we're kind of already seeing some of that right now.
The Chat Lounge. Chat Lounge.
Chat Lounge.
The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
China's economic growth is outperforming expectations, but questions remain. When will the property slump end? Can consumer confidence keep rising? How much will U.S. tariffs bite? Welcome to the Chat Lounge. I'm Tu Yun. Joining our discussion on China's economy are William Li, the Chief Economist with the U.S.-based Milken Institute, Dr. Li Wei, an Assistant Professor of Economics, Peking University, and Dr. Li Wei, Senior Lecturer at the Business School of University of Sydney. Thank you all for joining the chat. A warm welcome. Well, let's first take a look at the better-than-expected beginning. In the first 2 months, key economic indicators, including retail sales, industrial production, fixed asset investment, and service sector output, posted solid gains, surpassing market expectations. But were you surprised? Well, the question goes to you all. Shall we begin with the lady? Dr. Li Wei, please.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I think in terms of the figures, particularly about the consumption figures that have gone up, that is more than the expectation, is certainly something that I think people would have hoped that the policy have been put into place, have come into effective. But also, let's not forget that January and February is the traditional, Chinese Lunar New Year periods. And I think there's a lot of, holiday spending that come into that 8-day Lunar New Year holidays. And also, as we've seen that actually some of the sectors, for example, like movies and films, particularly being powered by the very extremely popular movie called Naza 2, certainly have actually pushed up the box office and as well as the consumptions. Yeah, so I think on the consumption funds, the figures have been quite positive. It's certainly, I think, within the expectation of people.
That's true. The festive effect there we've got. What about Dr. Li Wei?
Well, I'm not really surprised because, of course, we're seeing that indicators like retail sales and also industrial production, also investments are kind of going better than expected. And also, even though part of it is due to macro policy and increased demand, also seasonality, as Professor Li Wei just said, we have to keep in mind that some of these growths are actually before the 2 sessions announce the new policies. So I think it kind of indicates a fundamentally strong driving force behind domestic spending, surrounding, for example, the trading policies and other policies that boost consumption. And also it kind of reflects a improved expectation among investors and also consumers, mostly driven by improvements in innovation, in humanoid robots, and in technology. So I'm not really surprised. What I'm a little bit concerned or keep looking is how much of this momentum can be maintained in the rest of 2025, and what else can the government do to kind of keep the momentum going.
Indeed, I almost benefited from this trading policy, but at the last minute, I decided to wait for an upgraded massage chair. And to William there, does this surge really come as a surprise? A lot of foreign agencies like Bloomberg, they were saying that this outcome was beyond their expectations. So why?
Yeah, I have a slightly different angle on this. These data. What I'm surprised by is that so much of the policy is oriented toward boosting the supply side. It's been that way for quite a while now. And the fact that the supply side response is as meek as it is the part that is most surprising to me. And as far as the demand side is concerned, especially private demand, the strong retail sales, here in the West, I don't have the luxury of having access to a lot of the disaggregated data. I would like to know how much of the retail sales is in non-durable and discretionary consumption. That is, there's a lot of programs that are put in place, as you just mentioned, Tian, about swapping, right? Swapping a lot of consumer durables, swapping your iPhone, swapping your car, refrigerators for the newest model. And people will take advantage of that. They have taken advantage of that in the past. So that part of strong consumption, I'm not surprised by. What I would like to know is how much of the strong retail sales comes from the non-incentive portion of the consumption basket.
Why do you have that kind of question then?
Because I think a lot of the of the policies that we'll be talking about that was put in by the two sessions and reinforced by the sort of refinement and how a discussion about how it's going to be implemented, it is driven toward the supply side. The theory is we will boost the high value added sectors, improve people's wages, give them better jobs, high tech jobs, and the high income will naturally cause people to spend more. One of the things I mentioned on your show before is that thesis, the notion that supply creates its own demand, was something that was debunked in the 1930s when the United States depression was so severe that notion of income producing demand to spend that income just wasn't there. It's known as Say's law. And John Maynard Keynes came along and said Say's law doesn't work when people don't have any sense of optimism about the future.
So can Dr. Li Wei or Dr. Li Wei answer that question? Maybe Dr. Li Wei?
Well, I can certainly try. I mean, I think William raises a very interesting point that how much of this growth is direct response from policy, from the trading policy, or from like, if we, for example, remove the policy, would the growth still be sustained? I've got some data from the National Bureau of Statistics saying that the retail sales of, for example, communication equipment, furniture, and other household appliances, but basically those goods supported by the policy all witnessed a double-digit growth, some even in the 20% increase category. And for more general type of consumption, for example, like retail sales, general goods, they increased by like around 4%, restaurant or catering service by like 4.3%, something like that. So modest growth, but we're also seeing like, double digits growth in the area that's being, supported by the policy. Now, William also raises a very interesting point of whether supply can drive its own demand. And I think the logic here behind also the 30-point action plan is basically kind of boosting the disposable income of households. And how do you boost the disposable income? Of course, through their either labor income or other source of income, for example, from the stock market. Now, to boost their labor income, of course, you have to get the companies to pay them higher wages, and that will involve some sort of policy towards the supply side. That's not equivalent to saying, as long as we have a strong supply side, we'll automatically have a higher demand. There's, a translation, like how much of that income will be translated into consumption through what we call a marginal propensity to consume. So I think we can talk about the details of the 30-point action plan later, but I think William raises some very interesting points that I look forward to discuss.
Indeed.
Yeah. Sorry to jump in.
Sure.
I just want to
please.
add in a couple points. I think when we look into the supply side, how the Chinese economy is performing, it is very important to keep in mind how China is part of the global economy. So at the moment, I think there's tremendous amount of pressure globally in terms of the tariffs and also in terms of geopolitical shifts. So I think that would in fact have a huge impact on the supply side of how China is trying to make a progress in terms of the direction it's moving. The second point I want to make is I think it's not a simple policy to encourage supply side in terms of increase in general. What we're seeing in China is actually a transition from the old supply side to somehow the new supply side, which is the so-called new quality production supply side. So what it will mean is that even though the general figure on the supply side may not be seen very promising, but if we look into the specific areas, right, for example, into equipment manufacturing, into high-tech manufacturing, as well as into some of the areas to link to solar manufacturing and new energy vehicles. I would love to see in the end also figures in those areas. And I will be surprised to hear that if those areas have underperformed, because I think this is where exactly when we look into the supply side change, we also need to keep in mind that there's an overall shift in underlying thinking about China's development model, which is much more focused on high value added production, as well as more innovation driven production.
But there's also a question, would income or revenue increase in those sectors like equipment manufacturing mentioned by Dr. Li Wei just now would automatically translate into income rise in other sectors, so like clothing, right, which is a little bit obviously lower reaches of the supply chain?
Yeah, I have a view on this. I think at the moment, these two parts are not necessarily connected at the moment, because particularly when you look into consumption figures, the reality why consumption figures have been actually quite mild over the last few months or couple of years, I think is related to the old part of the economy, which is related to the real estate sector, where a lot of the household actually having their assets that are put into real estates, right? So when you have household assets that actually being affected because of the performance of real estate sectors, I think that's as a consequence of why consumptions could be quite mild. And then I think it will take a very long time for this new model of supply side, which is focused on high-end manufacturing, in the end to gradually improve the overall structure of the Chinese economy, and then goes into the income of the individual household, and then would have an impact on consumption. So I think certainly that will be the long-term plan. But at the moment, when we're seeing the weakness in consumption, I think a large part of it is related to the old model of development, which is heavily relying on, infrastructure and real estate development.
Yeah, to change that model also takes time.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
But for now, actually, the performance in the first 2 months is, arguably, I should say, believed to have laid a good foundation for success in meeting China's 5% annual growth rate target. Then comes the question, as Dr. Li Wei also mentioned, how long will this momentum continue is a big question. Then what economic concerns stand in the way of China reaching its targets and also of the momentum continuing like what we've already seen?
Well, I think I would ask the question slightly differently. What are the concerns standing in the way of China making the 5% target this year? Very little, because I think with sufficient boosting of the either old or new supply side, you'll get production up to the point where you can pretty much get close to 5% fairly easily, so long as the federal as well as state and local governments cooperate, because so much of the state-owned enterprises control that part of the economy. The real question, which Professor Li Wei alluded to earlier, was, can it be sustained? Will you be able to keep at 5% for the next 3 to 5 years? And I think that's where I have my doubts, because in order to have consumption, especially private sector consumption, grow at the requisite pace for that long period of time, you really have to fix two things. One is the perceived permanent income of consumers and their wealth, which are really two parts of the same thing. If household wealth feels like, and the wealth owners feel that their wealth is depressed and has no hope of coming back for the next 3 to 5 years, particularly the property market, it's going to be very hard to induce more consumption out of them. And if their job security and even more importantly, their social safety net, the retirement income that they're expecting is also considered to be less secure, that again will cause consumers to cut back on their consumption and sort of lower that marginal propensity to consume that Professor Li talked about. And so to me, the sustainability of 5% is the biggest question I have. Meeting 5% this year, you push hard enough and you'll get it. But what'll be the cost? As we will speak about in a moment, I guess, about the swap programs, I think that's just borrowing consumption from the future, right? Borrowing next year's consumption into this year. And so that is just displacing when you're going to consume, incentivizing people to consume more today and less tomorrow.
So you're saying it indicates that the Chinese government may want to learn from U.S. practices? Borrowing.
I think there are some lessons that they can take on. And one of them, to me, is a social safety net, the social security, hospitalization, healthcare at a higher level, and perhaps the hukou problem of just settling people's benefits for wherever they are residing rather than from where they originate. These are one of the few things that come to mind that we here in the West discuss as ways of putting in a more permanent solution to China's insufficient demand problem.
So, Dr. Li Wei, are we considering those long-term measures?
Well, I think that's part of the 30-point action plan is trying to implement. Of course, I completely agree with William's judgment that we need long-term measures and to kind of increase people's permanent income. Right now, I think one of the main concerns is that are worried about, for example, their labor income and whether their wages, their labor income is going to increase or decrease in the future. Now, there's a global trend of people are kind of substituting away from labor and towards capital, everywhere. Look, in the US, in Germany, in Japan, in China. So the share of labor income in GDP is already declining. And that, adding with especially with the unemployment pressure that we're facing last year, it's not creating such a good expectation in terms for the labor market side. But I think there are several points in the action plan that kind of address to this issue. One of them is providing allowances towards childcare, healthcare, and elderly care. So these things kind of get rid of the uncertainties that you have to face because, sometimes it can take a lot of money and resource to take care of the elderly, especially to prepare for their medical expenses. And those creates incentives for so-called precautionary saving. You save not because you don't want to consume, but instead you save because you're worried that tomorrow something bad will happen. So if the medical insurance or the childcare is more well equipped, then the middle-aged families doesn't have to worry that much about future something catastrophic will happen, and that will kind of ease their precautionary saving motive. But I mean, I don't think any policy, even those in the US, can be guaranteed to work, for example, for the next 30 years, because the government's budget constraint may change. We may have a debt crisis, for example, in the US. So I don't think like long term, the government can make such a credible promise. And even if it does, they still have to make some short-term policy recommendations or advices. Otherwise, we can't just let the households think long-term and without putting any short-term measures.
Then among the 30 points mentioned in the action plan the central government introduced, to consolidate the foundation, which ones, Dr. Li Wei, do you think are for short-term, which ones are for medium or longer term?
Okay, yeah, I think one of the main terms is that the plan is that to kind of guarantee a higher household income and also expanding income channels, for example, by addressing like the stock market and make sure that basically to kind of make people have more money to spend in their pocket. So I think in the short term, those are definitely good measures. Now, in the long term, we could theoretically boost consumption through purchases of real estate and cars, because those durable goods usually involves in mortgage or other debt-driven expenditure. So if you buy a house, basically it kind of lasts very long and also contributes significantly to the GDP. In the very long term, my bet would be on the AI plus or kind of technology-driven consumption, because we're kind of already seeing some of that right now. Like there's new gadgets, new robots being introduced every day in China. So I think maybe if we put more emphasis in areas such as AI or technology-driven consumption, in the long term, those things could turn out to be big. If everyone, for example, if every household started to buy a humanoid robot in their family, that's going to create a huge amount of consumption, and not to mention the maintenance, the repair for those robots, and so on.
What about Dr. Li Wei there? What's your evaluation of this 30-point special action plans? Some people say it's the country's most comprehensive package of policies for boosting consumer spending since the 1970s. But others say it's just merely a patchwork of previous measures, because a lot of measures, including those mentioned by Dr. Li Wei just now, were were repeated over and over again for a long time. So your take there, Dr. Li Wei?
Yeah, I think I agree with the previous comments that, I think this is an extension of what was the policy, aimed to increase consumption. But really, I think the key word is comprehensive. That I think it is very interesting actually to see that this package actually include measures such as employment and raising the minimum wage, as well as enforcing the paid annual leave system, as well as the childcare allowance system. This is something that actually will be on the card. So I think what it really shows is a deeper understanding of some of the challenge that actually related to pushing consumption up from the Chinese government. That it's not just that someone wants to change to a new mobile phone or switch to a new electric vehicle cars, but it is actually when people making decision about consumption, they have to take into consideration a whole range of things. And I think at the moment when we look into the Chinese economy, employment is something that people are looking actively at it, as well as the minimum wage. If wage level can go up, that's certainly a lot of the study have shown that, particularly for people who are actually having lower wage and lower wage consumers, actually study have consistently shown that if their income increased by $1 and their propensity to spend is actually much higher than if you increase the wage level of a very wealthy household in the economy. I think the childcare allowance system is also very important as well, because underlying the consumption challenge that China faces is also about the population challenge. So I think we are looking into the population growth rate. Last year has been actually slightly below zero. So what it will mean is that when you have a less populated economy, right, as what we're seeing in Japan, and it could very quickly happen to a lot of other countries, even individual household consumption level is high. If the total number of household, total number of population is small, then that could still be a very huge challenge for the policymaker in terms of push up the consumption level. So I think, yes, the keyword is comprehensive, and it's very interesting, to see the Chinese government actually, from a consumption angle and from the purpose of pushing a consumption actually is willing to change a policy related to employment and minimum wage, as well as childcare allowance system, as well as aged care service. So I think that's something that is quite commendable.
Right. Then of the action plan, William, is there anything that's eye-catching to you or you most look forward to?
Yeah, I think the one thing that everybody in China should be looking at is the size of this package and how long lasting it's going to be. The American saying is, have the authorities truly put their money where their mouth is. As far as I can see, the boost in the fiscal deficit goes from 3% of GDP to 4% of GDP, which is great. But historically, those kind of policies, incentives, boost GDP for every dollar spent by somewhere between 50 cents, half a dollar to less than $1. In other words, the fiscal multiplier in China has always been less than 1. That's because, again, of what Professor Li Wei said, which is the savings propensity of the Chinese consumer. And that partly ties to what Professor Li Lun earlier said, which is precaution. People are not going to spend their money unless they have a sense that they have security, both in terms of their employment and in terms of their income, not just today, but going forward. So for me, the thing I want to hear is some assurance that the fiscal spending will continue for at least the next 3 to 5 years, that will be there long enough to allow people to gain confidence that the Social Security that's being put in place will be there when I retire in 5, 10, 20, 30 years, that it won't be pulled back. And even more importantly, that it's not run by the provincial governments who might decide to change the policy objectives on their own. So I need something that ties the expenditures to something that is ongoing, that I can count on, that I will know will be there going into the future. And that I don't see at all. All I see are discussions of this year's policy target, this year's spending, how historically large the fiscal package is, how the new age industries are going to generate this enormous amount of income. But then, how much of GDP are these new age industries? I'm willing to bet even the broadest estimates is less than 20%. So I think the size and duration are the key here. And if it's a stop-go kind of policy where, next year, oh my God, the deficit is going to go to 5% of GDP, we're going to cut back. Well, no. If it's got 5% of GDP, it possibly could be pushed forward to 6% going up, because that's what's needed to put in the social safety net infrastructure that will guarantee the 30-year-old and 40-year-old worker that when they're 60, they will have government-paid Social Security.
We see your point, but the reason why you have this feeling from those measures probably is because the 5% growth rate is most urgent or imminent task that authorities have to tackle in the first place, right? Then from your perspective, William, among those measures, which one would you say can generate obvious results in the short term then? I guess
clearly the short-term ones are going to be the rebate packages, because, again, that's borrowing consumption from the future into today. So if I want to boost my results today, I will borrow like hell into tomorrow and then tell everybody, hey, I'll give you 50% discount on every new iPhone you buy, or any new luxury chair you buy, a massage chair, as you were mentioning earlier. So I can cut the discount and give government rebate on all that stuff, and that'll guarantee you boost consumption this year. But what's going to happen to the consumption next year? How many massage chairs are you going to buy next year?
All right, then.
So there are limits to that.
Of those measures, which ones do you see as being challenging to implement, or
the social safety net, the child care and social safety net of public pension or public-private pensions, or some kind of pension system that assures the worker that they'll have retirement income? I don't see the infrastructure for that in China, and I don't hear discussion of creating that infrastructure.
You don't hear it? What about Dr. Li Lun?
Yeah, I think those are actually some pressing concerns for Chinese households. Like knowing for sure whether you can have like a solid stream of income after you retire, and how much would that be? My mom recently retired. The retirement income comes as a surprise. Like before she retires, she doesn't even know how much income she's going to receive. So having a clear expectation for household, if I know this is the amount of money I'm going to earn my whole lifetime, of course I can. In some periods of my life, I borrow. In some period of my time, I save. But right now, because of this lack of expectation and transparency, people are behaving in a way that they're kind of worried about their especially after retirement. And we're talking in a scenario of an aging society. So this is, I agree, even though reluctantly to William, that this is actually a pressing challenge for China. Now, I think in the 30-point action plan, there are some short-term policies, but I also think how much the support and how long the support is going to maintain remains a question, because last year we kind of raised the deficit by 1%, and that's around $1.3 trillion. So if we divide that number by the population of China, that's around 1,000 yuan for each person. So it's not a huge amount of money. So if we're spending the measures to kind of increase the income by 100 yuan per worker, even though it's not much, it's already calculated to be 1/10 of the total increase in the deficit. I guess the main question for that is we have to make sure that in short term we don't, because globally we're facing a lot of uncertainties. There are going to be tariffs, and trade sanctions to China. So in short term, we don't kind of slide into a recession, and that's I think what this policy is hopeful to achieve. Because in the long term, honestly, I think some problems are very difficult to implement, and honestly, I can't really think of anything that's both credible and promising and also feasible.
This has been the Chat Lounge. After the break, check out how the sword of Damocles hanging over China may affect the country's growth. Don't go away.
Sideline Story brings you all things sports related. The hottest topics, latest events, juiciest stories, all with a very personal take. Subscribe to Sideline Story Podcast for heated sports discussions covering events that are happening in China and around the world.
Welcome back to the Chat Lounge. We continue our discussion of China's economy. But among those 30 points, I do see some, long-term ones, like Dr. Yun also mentioned, establishing childcare subsidies and promote wage growth, enhance employment support, improve social safety nets, support farmers' income.
But let's take social safety net. What does that mean? What exactly
the problem is you need some details. So that's why we're discussing here, right? You're an economist. So, William, maybe your suggestion for the government?
Well, in the United States, when Social Security was introduced, it was considered the end of the world by a lot of companies. You mean we're going to have to pay a tax just to support somebody in their old age? That's ridiculous. Our profits can't, we don't make enough profits to pay for that kind of stuff. We certainly can't afford it. But all you have to do is look to Europe. Right? I mean, Europe has specialized in providing a safety net that's so solid that people retire at the age of 55. So, if you want lessons on how to put in probably a bad social safety net, but certainly one that gives people a lot of guarantees and assurances and is very credible, the Europeans have done a darn good job of that. But it took them decades to put that in place. And they've found mistakes in doing that because the disincentive to work has reduced Europe to probably one of the lowest productivity continents on Earth. So there's some awful ways of doing it. And President Xi is really right to say he doesn't like transferring money into households because it just promotes laziness. There's something to that. But there's also something to the other side that says unless you transfer income from the public sector to the private sector in a credible way, you're not going to get people to start consuming. You're going to cause them to save excessively.
So what you're saying is just you want to warn that there is such risks that such action plan can turn out to be empty words.
Absolutely. I just point you to Europe, almost any country in Europe, and you'll see a disastrous social safety net. But on the other hand, I'll point you to Singapore, and they've got a phenomenal social safety net. And when I was mission chief to Singapore, I had suggested that the elderly just cannot depend on family for taking care of them in their old age. They accused me of not understanding Singapore and refused to do that. 2 years later, they put in exactly my recommendations. So I think there is a good way of designing a social security system where you can allow people to save and also contribute, match some of that saving, set up public institutions that can take care of the elderly. But it has to be done very carefully to preserve the incentive effect that they continue working hard today.
Actually, in China, there is some specific plans to help boost the welfare of the elderly, right? Dr. Li Wei, according to your study.
Yes, I think this is something that is quite interesting to hear the different perspective. What I'm seeing is that the point of social safety net, the point of elderly welfare, childcare provision it is indeed not new points. So these have been actually lots of discussion about it for quite a long time. The reality in China is that a lot of this responsibility actually fall under the local governments. For example, in terms of providing safety nets, in terms of providing education. So a lot of the responsibility is on local government. And as we know that over the last couple of years, local government budget has not been actually absolutely wonderful. So that's one of the, another challenge why pushing forward to these reforms have been actually quite difficult. So what I've been seeing here is, again, central government intervention coming into this place that I'm sure that they acknowledge the challenge of pushing forward those social reforms, but really actually starting to use consumption as a growth and as a point to bring it back to the local government to say, this is how we actually going to look at consumption as a growth, but also to enable us to do that. That's where the social part of the reform that needs to be able to put into place. So I think this is really a new way to looking into the local government's development model again, because traditionally we know a lot of it is relying on property development, and then in the end that will be the tax coming from selling the land, and then in the end that actually helps local government in terms of their budgets and everything. So at the moment what we're seeing is local government in China are trying to find out a new development model. So what I see these points is this new consumption points aim to bring out is also towards the audience and the local governments in China to say, this could be a new development model for you. But, however it will play out, I think as in all the Chinese policies and regulations, it will go through rounds of experimentation and how they would all fit together. So I think, it'll be interesting to see the long-term outcome of this, particularly sets of policies.
It's just like what Dr. Li Wei mentioned earlier. It's a comprehensive project. Only a social safety net is not enough to support the whole society, or with one leg, walking ahead is just too difficult, right? Because there are a lot of aspects, to the economy apart from a refined social safety net. And we also see two other sectors, it's the financial sector and the property market that are of a great concern of the government, at least for now. Right, they are also concerning domestic consumption. Right, the stock market, which is a barometer of economic health, that seems to have a clear upward trend recently, especially after financial institutions, including Citigroup or Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, sent out some messages to buy Chinese shares. But the property market continues to struggle a lot, though the decline has slowed a little bit in recent months. So the question is, what are your expectations for these two markets this year? I know, William, you're very much focused on social safety net, but in those two areas, what's your take?
Well, I think the property market really is key to unraveling some of the difficulties, and there, revamping the model of sales, I think, is really critical here. You cannot pre-fund the purchase of something and then allow the developer to take those finances and shove it somewhere else. You really have to have some kind of accountability on the part of the developer to say that if I'm paying for this flat or this house, it will be built using the funds I put in place. You cannot shift these funds to some other set of activities. So I think the need for governance and reform of the developer market, the way construction is financed, really has to be looked into more carefully. That at least will give the household some sense of security that what they pay for is what they'll get. And right now, that assurance has been eroded by the collapse of so many of the well-known developers, and really has been the root cause, I think, of some of the property market difficulties. The other thing is to take away the autonomy of local governments to finance and allow these developments to take place, and the disincentives they have in terms of using land sales as their only source of, or as their main source of revenues. Having more federal revenue sharing would go a long way to easing those issues. And if you were to somehow put a floor onto the value of property, that alone will go so far in assuring people that whatever wealth they have will stay there going forward. That's really one of the hindrances to consumption right now, aside from the social safety net issue, is wealth. And because so much of household wealth is in property, that has to be addressed. And of course, the other policy prescription, which I think the IMF and every other institution has recommended to China, is diversify household asset portfolios. Allow them to invest in other stuff other than property. Having more financial assets that are credible, long-lasting, and have some sense of government guarantee, perhaps, will go a long way to allowing the household wealth portfolio to stabilize. And those are the reforms, I think, that could easily be put in place in the financial sector that would go a long way to alleviating the need for precautionary saving on the part of households that Professor Li mentioned earlier.
Actually, it's also included in the 30-point action plan, expand investment channels. Dr. Li Lun, what would be your take here? Develop more bond products suitable for individual investors to diversify investment options, but how?
Well, I mean, related to William's point, I think property market is really complicated. We don't want the housing prices to have a crash that's going to have disastrous effect on the economy. We don't want it to rise too rapidly either, because that's going to create unhealthy expectations for investors, potentially causing a housing bubble. So we wanted to stabilize, meaning that if it stabilizes, it means basically your investment in the housing market is not going to give you such a high return. So where does the money go? It can either go to stock market, but the performance has been volatile. But I do think a lot of Chinese stocks are way underpriced because the PE ratio compared to other stocks like in the US or Hong Kong are actually in the pretty affordable range. But in the long term, can we expect, for example, the stock market to be the sole vehicle for saving and investment? I don't think so. So I still think that maybe through government bond or through other innovations in the financial sector, we could be able to prevent some other ways to investment. For example, I think there are a lot of startups in technology and also in AI related industries. If we can somehow funnel the money from the private household to these startups that needs the most support, it's actually driving the funds to the most productive sector of the economy. Of course, there's going to be risk, but I think if we kind of strengthen the role of venture capital, of other private, even foreign funds in this area, it could potentially be healthy to the economy as a whole.
Yeah, let me echo that, because I may sound self-serving when I say the other way of diversifying is allow domestic Chinese investors to go to the rest of the world and invest in other parts of the world as well.
They are now. It's just the channels are a little bit limited, right?
Yes.
Then what about this big headache, the property market? What should they do about it? Dr. Li Wei?
I think probably China has gone through the worst days of what's going on with the property market. There are still oversupply of property in the market at the moment. That's what we're seeing. But certainly, I think we are seeing, at least from the way that I have done a lot of research, that talking to some of the private sectors, that a lot of the private development companies basically are actively, a few years ago already, diversifying into other new areas. And those new areas usually will be into renewable energy, into healthcare, biopharmacy, AI sectors. So I think that we're seeing some big property developers over the last couple of years have really come into the news and actually really struggling a lot. But I think there is already quite a lot have been moving on from a real estate developer sector in China. That a lot of the companies are moving into new areas, diversifying their business. I think it'll take some time for the market to consume the oversupply of the properties, and I think it will take some time for the consumers to come back to reality to actually really understand, what will be the impact on the wealth level. But I think at least the risk in that sector is not as worse as what we're seeing a couple of years ago. However, I do see that now actually the risk really goes into the banking sectors now, because as we know that a lot of the real estate developments are financed through the banking system, as well as we talk about the local development model. The local governments, in terms of a lot of their actual revenue or expenses in somehow or investment into so-called infrastructure and real estate, are actually financed by the banking sector. So I think as the real estate sector is gradually moving out of challenge, I think what we're seeing now, it will be actually some challenge that really facing with the banking sector. And that's something that we should certainly keep an eye on in terms of what will be the potential impact. Look, in terms of investment from private consumers, I always think that it's very interesting to see that the Chinese consumers are very active in actually making investment decisions. And I say that because when you look into a share market, for example, in Australia, most of the investors are institutional investors. So it's just very interesting to see that actually when you look into Chinese share markets, a lot of the investors are private, individual household, mom and dad, who doesn't know much about probably, company return and everything, but they are making active investment into those channels. I think partially is going back to the reality of the social safety nets, and also people kind of are concerned about, the future and whether their wealth is going to shrink or not if they don't invest in property or in shares. So I think those expectations need to be changing, will change, but it will only change over time. It's not going to change in 1 or 2 days. So again, I think to provide people with social security, to provide people with not to worry about their future, not to worry about their kids' future, not to worry about their retirement, I think a lot of that would actually then steer away some of those investments into consumption, I think, which is the important part, where you can actually encourage people to spend more on the moments now that they're enjoying or they're working on, rather than have to worry about investing here and there because they worry about their future.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Indeed, and I think the authorities, they are well aware of those issues. It's a matter of time, but they also got a lot of, problems imminent to tackle. And just now we focused mainly on domestic issues. Now we turn to the external factors, which include U.S. tariffs and the levies imposed by other countries on China-made products. They're seen as the, sort of Damocles hanging over China. Then how would you expect them to affect the Chinese economy this year? Maybe William?
I think because so much of the export production is produced by industries that have relatively low value added and whose profit margin is very thin, many of those companies won't survive. In the sense that if a small price increase causes American consumers to buy the same T-shirt made in Honduras rather than China, they're going to do that. And that means the Chinese T-shirt manufacturers are going to go out of business because their profit margin is so small. But the larger manufacturers with slightly more profit margins, if they think that going into the U.S. market is important for their long-term strategy, I think they're willing to take some of that price and cut some of their prices to allow the American consumer to have less of a price increase. And that's going to be a business decision made company by company. And if China really wants to ensure Chinese companies' presence in the U.S. market, the government might also want to subsidize some of these companies and pay some of those tariffs here. I think that's a consideration I don't hear talked about very often, but that's the reality of business. And so the question to the policymakers and to Chinese businessmen would be, how important is the U.S. market? If it's important, then you do whatever you can to maintain your market share. If it's not that important, you can find other markets like in South America, in Eastern Europe, and in Asia, so be it. Then don't shift it to the U.S. Or I think the way that President Trump would put it is, come produce in the United States. Not only will you get tariff protection, you will get all sorts of income tax subsidies and deregulation to make it worthwhile for you to set up production in the United States. So when you said earlier, Chinese need to find alternate means of investing their savings to diversify the portfolios, investing in the United States directly like that would be a great way of doing it through Chinese companies. So there are many ways of handling the tariff barrier, which would benefit U.S. as well as Chinese workers and investors.
So you're saying U.S. tariffs or levies by other countries won't be a big problem for the Chinese economy?
It will be a problem, but it's solvable. It is solvable depending upon how innovative and creative you are in dealing with the U.S. And I just offered 3 or 4 solutions.
All right. And Dr. Leland?
I agree. I don't think the U.S. tariff, especially this round of tariff, is going to be a big concern for the Chinese economy. Last time, it hit us unexpected, but this time, pretty much all the exporters in China, before Trump even comes into office, realized that this is something that's about to happen. So I do think first the companies are going to make adjustments to prepare for this shock. And also related to William's point, I think tariff is basically a distortion on prices. It adds like a 20%. It's like a 20% tax on Chinese products. But the key question is, how much more expensive is the product going to be if we manufacture it in US instead? So if the answer is more than 20%, then we're relatively safe. Of course, we're going to have a smaller profit margin, but we still have an advantage in prices that it's still potentially profitable to export to US. Of course, we're also competing with other exporters, for example, those in Malaysia or other countries. But another way out of this is that we can provide product varieties that other countries doesn't offer. For example, DJI drones, or as we have seen, the Spring Gala, the humanoid robots. If you simply can't offer similar products in U.S. markets by domestic manufacturers, then no matter how much the tariff it is, the consumers are still going to want to buy that, and their only resort is from China. So I simply don't think that this tariff is going to have such a damaging effect in hitting the 5% goal, especially this year. But I mean, if it continues, it's probably going to cause some deeper reconstruction of our industry structure. For example, how much of our economy is going to depend on export driven, especially to North America, and how much of our economy is going to depend on domestic consumption. That's probably going to change.
And Dr. Li Wei, I guess you share similar views?
Well, I think, in terms of the export market, that U.S. is still the largest export market for China. So it counts for around 15% of the export share. What has been happening in the first term of Trump was very much a direct tariffs on Chinese manufacturers, right, on China. And what we have seen is a big movement of actually manufacturing offshoring or friendshoring. That means a lot of Chinese companies are moving their factories to Southeast Asia, to South America, and in order to bypass that tariffs on Chinese companies. What we see now in Trump, what I call 2.0, is that there's a huge realization of what's been happening in Trump 1.0 by simply imposing tariffs on China is not enough. So increasingly we're seeing the approach from U.S. is approach to impose tariffs on general. So that will mean there's an understanding of China being the center of the global value chain. So in order to actually put a stop on China's growth is to disrupt that global value chain. So that's why I think you're seeing that a lot of the new policies coming from the U.S. is about, in general, tariffs on every country. So for example, when we come to steel and aluminium, there's a big debate in Australia just a few weeks ago about, we've been a very close ally with U.S. Therefore, there should be exemption for Australia for exporting steel and aluminium to U.S. But the response in the end that we get is that no, this is a tariff on every single country. So what I think is U.S. is really trying to redefine global trade and redefine that global value chain. Now, obviously, this is going to take a very long time because the global value chain system that we see now, it takes decades to build. So how long is it going to take for U.S. to encourage manufacturing to go back to U.S. and then to become the global center of global value chain? I think it'll take a very long time. But it does present some complexities as well as opportunities for China. I think in the end, some of the traditional allies of the U.S. economy now started to realize, they're not necessarily being taken into good consideration in the whole discussion about tariffs, sanctions. And the other point is about, I think, talking about policy consistency, that China is still actually, over the last few years, pursuing these Belt and Road policies quite a lot. The reason I say so because my research looking into Chinese investment into Australia, we have seen that actually there's a very low level of Chinese company engaging in Australia, where a lot of the Chinese companies now are moving into the Belt and Road countries. So certainly I think that it's not just exports expanding in the Belt and Road country as what we can see from the statistics, that 2024 there's 6.4% increase. But we also see that Chinese investment into Belt and Road country have also increased 6.5% in 2024. So what it means is that, there's an active strategy that is coming out from China over the last few years, and there's consistency in it in terms of pushing China's engagement with the Belt and Road country to diversify its trade. I think finally, when you look into the export figure for China for last year, is the growth of the ASEAN country. So in the end, this is where I think as a part of the global geopolitical uncertainties, what's going to see is there's lots of anti-globalization. But what China is trying to take advantage of is the regionalization, which means actually much more integration into the Southeast Asia country, but also in terms of facilitating investment and trade within the region. I think that would drive some of the growth in terms of China looking into its export market. It will be still challenging, but I think as now every country in the world have realized that it's not just China is facing a challenge. I think every economy is facing that challenge right now.
Indeed. And to our last question, I understand William is a long-term thinker, and I believe Dr. Li Wei and Dr. Li Wen, and in fact, all economists are and should be, right? But this time, we focus our attention on, the rest of the year or the coming year. So given what we've discussed, how difficult would it be for China to achieve 5% growth this year? I understand William might think it's not a big problem. It's quite easy. But can you give us a snapshot of the Chinese economy by mid-year and year-end, and highlighting the key trends you want to emphasize? Shall we begin with William, please?
Well, I think let me give you a pessimistic scenario, right? Every economist has got a calling card of the dismal science. I have to do at least one pessimistic scenario, which is if you fail to really reform the state-owned enterprise sector and innovation starts to stall out and you can't protect intellectual property, then consumption, I think, is going to stall because the confidence in having income starts to go down even further because state and local governments start to lay off even more. Or if somehow the tariff situation doesn't cause Chinese businesses to reconsider their export market and where to shift their production, then I think we can face something where China's GDP stagnates to maybe 3 to 4%. And the SMEs will be squeezed by this kind of deflation and overcapacity that many of them face. But I think a more likely scenario is that China will wind up somewhere between 4.5 to slightly under 5, maybe 4.8, with the private sector trying to expand. But the key will be, again, whether there's a credible sign that the deeper reforms, SOE restructuring and credible social safety net and a way of boosting rural income and rationalizing the financing of state and local governments. If those things are done in a way that is credible, I think we are in that range of 4.5 to 4.75. I don't think you'll reach 5 unless the private sector kicks in. And you don't kick in a cheap way, like borrowing a lot of durable consumption from the future, but rather really getting the consumer to start to credibly spend because they're confident their permanent income and wealth situation is being restored. So that's my little outlook scenario, the pessimistic one and the more likely one.
Sure. Advice well received. And Dr. Li, please.
Yeah, I think a key measure to look at is by the half of 2025, like what's the growth rate for the first half. Now, I think economists are pretty bad at making accurate predictions, but I agree with William that I think first we need to kind of downplay a little bit about whether we hit like 5.0% or instead we only hit 4.8%, but we are seeing a more healthy product market, more healthy, more competitive structure for the market. So I would rather have a not meeting the 5%, but rather have a deep structural reform for the market structure rather than meeting 5% this year, but from next year onwards only hitting 4%. So in order to maintain that long-term growth target, I think keeping the consumers to be optimistic about the future is important. Also, transformation of the out of date or even less efficient companies or industries are also important. But also, we need to provide some sort of allowance or subsidy to households, especially low-income households, to make sure that they're not lag behind in this age of development.
Well said. And last but not least, Dr. Li Wei, please.
Yeah, I think, there are many challenges, but in general, I think it's achievable. One of the things is that I think this is what Chinese government would try everything in order to achieve these targets. That we've seen that over the last few 2 sessions, the emphasis is increasingly on actually make sure that there's growth, but there's stability. So in 2023, the growth target was 5.4, 2024 was 5%, and 2025, I think now is at above or below 5%. So I think what it has shown is really a shift in the Chinese approach in terms of looking into GDP growth rather than, high growth, 2-digit growth. But now the main focus is on stability and then growth. So that's when I think they will try everything to maintain that 5% growth.
On that note, we wrap up this session of the Chat Lounge. Many thanks to Dr. Li Wei, Senior Lecturer at the Business School of University of Sydney, Dr. Li Lun, an Assistant Professor of Economics at Peking University, and William Li, Chief Economist with the US-based Milken Institute, for your time and insights. The show is available on all major podcast platforms. Please email us your comments at radio@cgtn.com. I'm Tu Yun. Thank you for listening. Join us again for more chat at the Chat Lounge next week.
I cannot marry you while your mother regards me.
Step into the world of timeless elegance with Mrs. Spring Fragrance, a captivating audiobook by Edith Eaton, read by Man Ling.
Because the green leaf still clings to the bough.
Experience the lively yet complex lives in Chinese American communities at the turn of the 20th century as Edith Eaton's delicate prose weaves together themes of tradition, change, love, and identity.
Forget all that belongs to the joy of life.
Follow the journey of Mrs. Spring Fragrance and witness the struggles and fights of those living on a rapidly changing exotic land while holding on to their cultural traditions, or more importantly, to their identities.
He could hardly believe that his daughter was seriously opposed to becoming the wife of such a good-looking, prosperous young merchant as Wang Ling.
Join Books and Beyond for Mrs. Spring Fragrance. Let the stories come to life in your imagination. Subscribe to Books and Beyond for free on your favorite podcast platforms, or log on to radio.cgtn.com for more.
Ever wondered what's actually going on in Africa through the perspective of an African? How are things really going between China and Africa? What's the narrative of this relationship? Well, get a perspective with China-Africa Talk. Hear from African diplomats, entrepreneurs, academics, Chinese natives, and more. Get on our wavelength every week to find out what's real with China-Africa Talk. Find us on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcast, and more. We'll see you there.